Hey all, it's Matt, your average gamer, and for this video we're going to be going over 7 more powerful and fun builds in Elden Ring's DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree. This is going to be a great video for people that like a lot of versatility. We've got a lot of cool ones in this one. This is going to be spoiler free in terms of bosses and whatnot. However, the last 2 weapons on this list, and you may have saw them on the thumbnail, there will be some discussions about the final boss of the DLC. I will give a spoiler warning, of course, though, ahead of those 2 weapons. And of course, we'll have a lot of versatility in terms of stats and different builds. This is going to be my top 7 fun and powerful combination builds that are both enjoyable and good to use. We're going to start here at number 7, the Spirit Glaive. Now, this weapon's pretty interesting in the fact that it's a halberd, but it's relatively light at a weight of 6.5. So you have a decently light weight, around 600 AR, and the Ash of War is pretty cool too, as it's basically a magic version of Sword Dance that sends out additional magic damage when you use the weapon's Ash of War, and it's pretty good, honestly. For the lightweight of the halberd, it does enough damage. It can build up on successive attacks with the regular hits, and then you can get some additional magic damage with some investment in intelligence too. This is one no doubt I recommend trying if you're looking for a dexterity and intelligence build. This is another option that you have for that versatile class. Now, for me personally, I think the Ash of War is a lot of fun to use on this one, and it does do a good amount of damage. Is it the most overpowered one? No, it's probably the least powerful one on this list, but it's still fun and pretty good to use. We're going to jump into equipment, stats, everything you need to know. After we use the Ash of War one more time, of course, it is really cool to use. Again, essentially Sword Dance magic version. We have the Spirit Glaive, preferably plus 10, any seal for buffs. We did hit 51 poise. We have Maleficent's Prosthesis, Shard of Alexander, Magic Scorpion Charm, Winged Sword Insignia, Magic Tier, and Faith Tier 2. By the way, the helm I'm using adds 1 point of intelligence at Faith, so we would have 33 Faith, so we could use Hellish Shabriri, Golden Vow, of course. We have 35 intelligence, we have 45 dexterity with Maleficent's Prosthesis, 60 vigor 2 for this build. And where do you get this really cool weapon? Well, you're going to get it in this red area that's only accessible, by the way, from the Grand Altar of Dragon Communion. Keep that in mind. It's somewhere down here after you go down to this location. The only way to get that is through there. And at number 6, we have the Death Knight's Longhaft Axe. This axe does lightning and physical damage, has really cool charged attacks, a good amount of damage on the jump attacks too, and then it's got a really cool Ash of War, and I believe it's called Blink Bolt. Basically, you'll disappear for a second, and then you'll get a follow-up attack with right trigger or R2 if you're on PlayStation, and that follow-up attack does a good amount of damage too. I really enjoy the charge attacks with this one too, by the way. They have a lot of range, they kind of drag on the ground a little bit, and they do good damage. So the correct investment here is, this is basically a strength and faith build, which, by the way, strength and faith has a lot of versatility, so there's so much you can do with it. But for the physical part of the weapon, you're going to invest in strength, and then if you want more damage out of the lightning for this specific weapon, it's faith based. Now, typically, you're probably used to lightning scaling with dexterity on your weapon, which is the common way it would do that with something like the Bolt of Grandsex. This weapon's a little bit different, and it actually has faith scaling, so you're going to invest in both strength and faith pretty split, and you'll be able to get good damage out of the Ash and the weapon itself. Yeah, so there's the charge attack right there, though it took a decent amount of rot damage there. The charge attack does good damage, as I mentioned, good poise damage. It's definitely one of the great options that you have with this weapon itself. And then, of course, the Ash of War is really good, too. This is one that's absolutely fun to use and highly recommended. Yeah, you're going to see me use the charge attacks a lot on this one because you're going to get a substantial amount of damage from them. The Ash of War is good, don't get me wrong. It could absolutely be useful for dodges too with a follow-up attack, but the charge attacks, light attacks, everything about this weapon, you're going to get good AR and damage out of it. By the way, I want to hear in the comments below, how far are you into Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree? Have you beaten it yet? Are you at the late game? Are you at the mid game? Are you at the early game? Have you not even started it yet? I'm curious as to how far you are in Shadow of the Erdtree. Let's jump into equipment. For a powerful Longhaft axe build, we have it at plus 9, preferably plus 10. We have the Erdtree seal. We hit 53 poise on this one. Ritual Sword Talisman, Lightning Scorpion Charm, Axe Talisman, Shard of Alexander. And then we have the Lightning tier and the Spike Crack tier 2 to boost those charge attacks. Again, I really like the charge attacks on this one. For stats, we have 60 Vigor, 23 Mind, 28 Endurance. We have 40 Strength, that's 60 when we're two-handing it, 45 Faith, And then, of course, we're going to be using our buffs like Golden Vow and Flame Grip Restraint. You could use Halishabirio, that'll give you a little bit additional damage, although with the DLC, I've been using that one a little bit less because of the increased damage taken. And where do you get this cool weapon? You get this weapon at Scorpion River Catacombs in Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. That's pretty far into the game, probably around late in the mid-game. You're going to grab it right on the map there by defeating the boss at the end of those catacombs. And number 5, we have Raksasa's Great Katana. This Great Katana is really cool. I love the Great Katana class in Shadow of the Erdtree. They're awesome to build around. They could do a lot of damage, and this one is no exception with a really fun to use Ash of War. So basically the Ash of War is going to be a sweeping action that if you follow through with it, it has a couple of different actions in total. Now, it's not going to do a ridiculous amount of bleed buildup, and the weapon, as far as I know, is not infusible. You can't put Blood Flame on it or anything like that. But again, you get a lot of physical damage out of the weapon, and it has good AR. And the Ash of War we're talking about here is Weed Cutter. Weed Cutter is the Ash of War we've been talking about. And yeah, it's not going to be something that you're going to get an insane amount of bleed buildup because you're getting 55 bleed, right, on the weapon. Not really infusible, nothing too much that you could change. However, you could build up on successful attacks and then make use of the good physical damage and high AR that the Great Katana class has in Shadow of the Erdtree. Still a cool weapon and no doubt one I recommend trying out, definitely for fun with good damage. We have Rakshasa's Great Katana, preferably +10. We have any seal for buffs. We have his armor set on 2. Shard of Alexander, Ritual Swords Talisman, Winged Sword Insignia, Listens Prosthesis. Then we have the Thorny tier and the Dexterity tier too. Now, I don't really recommend Lord of Blood's Exaltation or the White Mask because you're only going to get a bleed proc once in a while with the bleed build up on this one. We have 60 Vigor, 18 Mind, 26 Endurance, 85 Dexterity with Listens Prosthesis and the Dexterity tier, 25 Faith for buffs. And then we're going to be using, once again, Golden Vow as our aura buff, 15% attack and defense, and then Flame Grant Me Strength for our body buff. You can only stack one of each, keep that in mind. That's going to give us an additional 20% physical damage. And where do you get this cool weapon? You get it at the Eastern Nameless Mausoleum. That's the one all the way to the right. Relatively mid-game-ish, I believe, for this one. You're going to have to take on the boss there, who will be wielding the katana. Next one up here, we have the Lizard's Greatsword. This is a farmable weapon you can get in the catacombs. I'll show you where to get it. And it has an additional hit, essentially, on the charge attacks. It has a small projectile that adds on to the damage, making this one solid here for bleed buildup and also for great charge attack damage. So what we did here, since this is infusible, is we ended up using a Blood Ash of War on this, using the charge attacks, and then of course we're going to end here with Wild Strikes, which is our preferred Ash of War, and you can get a lot of bleed buildup on this weapon. I believe I ended up with around 137 bleed buildup and a lot of physical damage too. And shortly here, we're going to be jumping into equipment stats, everything you need to know for this build. By the way, we have enough arcane to use this. I actually meant to mix that in. We're going to mix that one in on the next build that you get from the big dragon boss in the DLC. Minor spoiler there. In a second here, equipment stats, everything you need to know to make a powerful Lizard's Greatsword build. And honestly, had a really cool infusible weapon, a weapon that you could change the Ash of War on, do whatever you want with. We have the Blood Lizard's Greatsword with Wild Strikes. We're using the Dragon Communion Seal. We have 51 poise. We have the Axe Talisman, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Melissa's Prosthesis, Shard of Alexander, Spike Crack tier, Faith tier 2. And for stats on this one, we of course have 60 Vigor for pretty much all these builds, I believe, because I recommend 60 Vigor for the DLC. It's a challenging DLC. We have 20 Mind, 25 Endurance, we have 35 Dexterity, we have 53 Arcane, so you could use that incantation that I think I forgot to use. We're going to use that one soon, though. We are using Golden Vow and Flame Grip Strength to buff. If you want more balanced stats at 150, by the way, you could go with 45 Dexterity and 45 Arcane. This weapon leans Dexterity as its other stat, by the way, not Strength, just to clarify that, so you want to invest in Dexterity and Arcane. And where can you net yourself this weapon? Well, you get it at the Fog Rift Catacombs. This one you can get really early. You don't even have to go through any of the early dungeons in the DLC or anything like that. You could pretty much make your way up here before Castle Enzies, and then in there, the imps that wield it will drop this, and I recommend grabbing this one for sure. And next up here, we're going to end up using Baal's Flame Lightning here. And we have number 3 is Flowerstone Gavel. And Flowerstone Gavel, now the lightning on the gavel, we're going to talk about how it scales. And of course, we're able to use our incantation here. And we kept similar stats from the last build as well. Now, unlike the last build, I do want to mention one thing. For this one, since I kept stats, and I just didn't want to respec for this one because the lightning is going to scale with arcane. We'll talk about that in a second. You would invest in strength and arcane rather than dex and arcane. We have Flowerstone Gavel, preferably +10, Dragon Communion Seal. We hit 51 poise. We have the Ritual Swords Talisman, Lightning Scorpion Charm, Two-Handed Sword Talisman I like, Shard of Alexander, Lightning Tier, and then we have the Faith Tier for buffs too. Now, the same stats as last build, however, I would change something here. You do not need the dexterity in this case because the lightning actually doesn't scale with dexterity here. Rather, it scales with arcane. We're going to show that in a second. Now, for this, I would recommend having 30 as strength, which gives you 45 two-handed, and then having 53 arcane, so you use that cool incantation too. And that's Baal's Flame Lightning, which is a really fun one to use, by the way. We have 60 Vigor, we have 20 Mind, 25 Endurance for the rest of our stats. And then, of course, with all these builds, I'm going to say it again a second time, make sure you have 60 Vigor for the DLC, and make sure you're grabbing those Scatter fragments too. I feel like a lot of people are missing those, not grabbing them. You need to power up. Alright, this weapon's lightning does not have dexterity scaling. I'm going to show this first. We're using a talisman to increase arcane, and we ended up with over 1600 damage. I tested this multiple times, by the way. We're going to rest and try this again without the arcane boosting talisman. And let's see how much damage we get going up to the enemy here. Of course, also unaware at 1547 rather than over 1600. So the lightning scales with your arcane stat. You get this at the Grand Altar of Dragon Communion. But worth mentioning is I believe you have to defeat the big dragon Baal first and then go back and grab this. I think it's an invader that actually drops this really cool weapon. Alright, now time for some spoilers before we talk to anything related to these weapons. These weapons are related to the remembrance bosses at the end of the game. We're going to show off both weapons as people have been asking builds for them, and then I'm going to explain how they work and how they scale too. And now I've ranked these two. This is the one I like less. I like this one substantially less than the next one, and this is the Sword of Light, which allows you to have a charging dash attack that follows up with additional magic damage and does a lot of physical damage. Now, how do these weapons scale? I'm going to talk about it in the next clip too, but basically, essentially, these are quality weapons. Maxed out, I believe you're going to get a C in strength and a C in dexterity. It's going to lead slightly more towards strength, and then you get a little bit of intelligence scaling as well. And this one does hit hard, don't get me wrong. You have a chargeable attack on it too that's really cool that follows up with a bunch of magic damage. And it looks like holy damage, but it appears to be magic damage along with the intelligence scaling. We have the Greatsword of Radon Light, +10 preferably, any seal for buffs. We did hit 51 poise. We have Millicent's Prosthesis, Shard of Alexander. We have the Magic Scorpion Charm. Godfrey Icon, this is chargeable, by the way. I did test that. Magic tier as well as the Faith tier too. And for stats on this one, we have 60 Vigor, 20 Mind, 28 Endurance. We have 35 Strength. We have 24 Dexterity. That's the minimum Dexterity requirement, by the way. We have 36 Intelligence with our Helm on, which adds a point. 34 Faith, with the Helm on, also adds a point, so we could use Hellish Shabiri for additional damage. And then, of course, we're going to be using Golden Vow, too. And we're going to talk about the second weapon now, and we're going to go into the scaling a little bit more here, too. Number one, we have Lord's Radon Sword. The Lord's version is my preferred version of the two. All right, now it's time to talk about the one issue I have with these weapons. These weapons, both of them, by the way, scale primarily with weapon level and then have minimal additional scaling in terms of intelligence and the amount of magic damage you can get from the Ash of War. So this is going to put it along the same realm of Ruin's Greatsword, the Watchdog Staff, the original Starscore's Greatswords, very similar to those in terms of how the scaling is basically, for these it's quality, for some of them it's strength, and then after that, as far as the Ash of War goes, even though they're magic damage, they have minimal scaling in terms of intelligence investment. So if you're going to invest in your intelligence stat, and I did test it, by the way, I went for 60 intelligence to see if I can get a lot more damage on the Ash of War, and then I ended up respecking more towards a quality build, and my damage wasn't a crazy amount better. It seems to be relative towards weapon level, and then the physical damage on the weapon, which is strength and dexterity. With all that said, the Lord's Sword, specifically the Radon Sword Lords, I wish they kind of had better names than just, Light Lords and then Radon Sword. But anyway, it has an amazingly cool Ash of War. There's no doubt this Ash of War is cool. However, I do have basically a fear that on New Game Plus and beyond, this weapon could fall off a little bit, much like the original Starscore's Greatswords. Because basically weapon level seems to be a big factor here along with a quality build. We have the Greatsword of Radon, Lords plus 10 preferably, any silver buffs, hit 51 poise, Melissa's Prosthesis, Shard of Alexander, Magic Scorpion Charm, Ritual Swords Talisman for this one. We have the Magic tier and Faith tier too. And for stats on this one, we have 60 Vigor, 20 Mind, 28 Endurance, we have 35 Strength, we have 36 Intelligence, don't forget about that extra point we're getting, 23 Faith, which is 33 Faith with the Faith tier, now 34 with that extra point on the Helm. And then, of course, we're using Golden Vow, and I chose Halashiburi for these two specifically because I wanted to increase that amount of magic damage that we're getting on the Ash of War any way I could, and Hal ended up working out for that. As you can see against Radon here, we were able to get good damage. Ultimately, it turned into a really good build. Remember to keep having fun when you're playing Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. I know a lot of people are having difficulty with the DLC because it is hard. Don't listen to people. If you need to use summons, use summons. If you need to use co-op, use co-op too. Don't forget though, if you summon 2 people, it can get a lot harder. It scales up a lot more with 2 people. If you're using co-op, it's better to just use 1 person and go at it that way. Thanks for watching this one. I appreciate everybody that tuned into this video on my top 7 fun and powerful builds. Don't forget to sub if you're not subbed yet, because we're going to be covering a ton of Elden Ring content throughout the summer, maybe even the rest of the year, with 95 new weapons, a whole bunch of new spells and incantations. There is a lot to go through with Shadow of the Erdtree. They've given us a ton of content. It really truly is Elden Ring 1.5. Maybe even Elden Ring 2. I mean, the size of the DLC is great. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day.